کاوش مدیا.
Iran won't be singled out on the missile issue. If you're sitting in Tehran, you see American troops in Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, until last year also Afghanistan. So, and on top of that, if you're Iran, you see regional rivals that are very well armed, including, I might add, with their own highly capable missiles. So for Iran, as crazy as it sounds to us in the West, Iran sees missiles as bringing a stability or bringing a balance to the equation in the Middle East. There are concerns about Iran potentially building an ICBM. There are concerns about Iran's transfers to non-state partners in the region. Concerns about Iran's increased willingness to use precision missiles across its borders, as we saw just about a week ago with the missile attack on Erbil. So if Western countries want to start a diplomatic process, there needs to be some agreement about what the priority is. Otherwise, you're not going to get very far. And I think different countries have different perspectives about what the priority is. And while we're talking about that, of course, Russia and China, who were instrumental in the nuclear negotiations, don't really see Iran's missiles as problematic at all. Final point I want to make is addressing missiles in the context of Iran on one side of the table and world powers on the other side, sidelines regional countries, which was one of the big problems, perhaps, with the nuclear agreement. Countries in the region are the ones most at risk, most concerned, and most under threat.
And as well as that, there's also the problem around cruise missiles. Now, Iran's ballistic missile program has been the principal source of concern for many years, but its cruise missile program has been steadily maturing as well. Now, cruise missiles are much more difficult to detect than ballistic ones, as they emit smaller infrared signatures. And Iran has also used its cruise missiles for targeted strikes in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, most prominently in 2019 against 2 Saudi Aramco processing facilities, which temporarily halved Riyadh's oil production. The second problem is the issue of testing by proxy. So Iran might seek to cheat a moratorium by transferring newly designed or developed systems to third parties and have them conduct the tests themselves. Now, in a way, Iran already sort of does this. It does a testing by proxy program through the transfer and use of ballistic and cruise missiles to the Houthis in Yemen. And it amounts to a form of field testing where it provides Iran the opportunity to assess the capabilities and reliability of the system and also refine the technology and the tactics that are around that.
Iran sees the missiles as the sort of primary guarantor of its security. It's when they talk about deterrence, I mean, here in the US, when we talk about deterrence, mostly we're talking about nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So when Iran talks about deterrence and their deterrent, it's missiles. Missiles are, you can't stress enough the lessons learned from the war with Iraq in the 1980s. That experience still weighs heavily on the policymakers in Iran. And the biggest lesson they took away from the war in the 1980s was we didn't deter Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein invaded and deterrence failed. So we need to do whatever we can to keep our deterrence as strong as possible. And actually, going back to the Ukraine issue, if you read the Iranian media over the last few weeks, one of the sort of strands of thinking you'll see in the papers is this sort of line of thinking that if Ukraine had a stronger deterrent force, Russia might not have invaded. So the Ukraine war is sort of reinforcing some of these preconceptions in Iranian thinking about we should never give this stuff up because look what happens to the countries that give it up.
And then also when you consider the threat mix of when you use ballistic, cruise, and direct attack UAV at the same time, it's really difficult for air systems to overcome this, even sophisticated ones. And again, when you're thinking of, when the Saudis are having to, blast off some really expensive Patriots, to intercept these, that's a lot. That's when then you consider that the missile that's fired might be, a few $1,000s, or it's a fairly cheap UAV that's being struck with an air-to-air munition. I mean, the economies of scale are huge. So it's a cheap and effective way for the Iranians to inflict pain and punishment on the Saudis, and also now on the UAE as well with the number of attacks they've had in the last couple of months. And I think from the Iranian perspective, it's working. It seems to be a fairly effective strategy, and it's really difficult to create defensive solutions and systems that are as cheap as that, because it's incredibly difficult to detect, track, and intercept a missile, but it's fairly easy just to launch something off that is fairly easy to put together, and you can use dual use goods, whatever those may be as well, to put the thing together. So I think it's a serious problem, and I don't think there's any really easy solutions to it.
آنچه در مورد ما میگویند